Hello and welcome back to Learn Linux TV. In today's video, I have in front of me something that I bet you didn't think you'd ever see in front of me in one of my videos, an actual MacBook. But not just any MacBook, this is the latest model of the MacBook Pro 13 with the M1 ARM-based processor, the one that everyone is talking about. So what the heck is a Linux guy doing with a MacBook, and why is he creating a video about it on a YouTube channel that is dedicated to Linux? Well, I thought it'd be fun to give you guys a Linux user's perspective on the MacBook, and since the M1 model just came out, I felt like it was a great time to go ahead and create this video. I've actually been thinking about doing this video for about 2 years now, I just never got around to it, but I figured it's a great time to get that done. Now before we get started, a quick disclaimer. I realize that I am not the intended audience for the MacBook. I've had a MacBook for quite some time now, but I've only used it on average maybe once or twice a month or so for one-off things that required me to show footage from macOS if I was showing how to install a Linux app or connect to a Linux server from a MacBook. I wanted to have something on hand that I can use to create that footage, and also something for one-off situations where I had to do something proprietary that didn't work on Linux. That doesn't happen very often, but that's why I have a MacBook. And again, I use it on average once or twice a month. So what that means is this will not be a complete review like you would get from an Apple person that knows the platform better than I know it. But again, I thought it would be fun to give you guys a Linux user's perspective. And you know what? It was very easy for me to get the M1 model because when I looked on eBay for the prices that the 2018 MacBook Pro, the one that I had, was selling for, it was only like a few $100s shy of just buying the M1 model. So I figured, why not upgrade? And I took a really big risk by doing this because I realized that the M1 CPU is brand new. You know, when Apple switches from one platform to another, it's usually a little rocky. So yeah, it was a risk in my doing this, but you know, that's part of the fun, right? So let's go ahead and dive into the review, and I'll give you my thoughts on the latest MacBook Pro 13. So first of all, let's talk about the hardware. When I compare this to the 2018 model that I put up on eBay in order to buy this one, the chassis doesn't really seem all that different to me. And I also thought that it was interesting that there's still a really large bezel around the screen. And that was the case on the previous model that I had, but I kind of thought that by now Apple would want to get rid of more of the bezel because that seems to be something that pretty much everyone is asking for. And when you look at similar models from Dell as well as System 76, they got rid of the bezels a lot more than Apple has. So when I look at this screen, I kind of feel like I'm looking into the past. The screen quality is really good and it's really bright, so I don't really have any problems with screen clarity. I just find it strange that the bezel is so thick, but it doesn't really get in the way of my using it. The keyboard on the 2018 model is one of the keyboards that had a lot of recalls and complaints. And I've never really had any issues with mine ever, but I was only using it about once or twice a month, so I wasn't using it as heavily as someone would be using it if it were their daily driver, which might be why I didn't run into any problems. I felt that the keys on that model were way too shallow, and I didn't enjoy typing on that keyboard at all. I like the keyboard a lot better on this model because it actually has more key travel, and it has more of a tactile feel to the keys that was missing in the previous version. On this model, they've changed the touch bar a bit. The escape button actually becomes a physical button like it used to be, and honestly, it should have always been a physical button. And just like the previous model, the power button doubles as a fingerprint sensor, which I think is pretty cool actually. And as you would expect, the keyboard is backlit. Now, I wouldn't say that this is the best keyboard that I've ever typed on, but it's decent. I would say that it's pretty much equal to the Lemur Pro from System 76. I might like that one a little bit more, but that might be just because, well, I'm more used to that computer than this one. I don't really think there's anything I can complain about when it comes to the keyboard. It's totally fine. When it comes to the trackpad, I think it's actually a strength of the Apple platform. They have one of, if not the best trackpads in the business. I like that it's actually on the large side, and I also like the gestures that are supported in macOS as well. And it's not just using 2 fingers to scroll up and down. I mean, every trackpad does that. I like the gestures such as the one that you use to switch workspaces, which is a 3-finger swipe to the left or the right that I can use to switch between the workspaces. I think that's pretty cool. Now when it comes to Linux, the GNOME desktop, and possibly other desktop environments, they support gestures as well, but when it comes to GNOME specifically, most of the gestures are actually reserved for people that are running in Wayland, which is actually the next generation of the display manager that will replace Xorg someday. So not very many people will know that the GNOME desktop has great support for gestures because, well, most of us are running in Xorg nowadays because there's a few bugs to work out when it comes to Wayland. It's great that the GNOME desktop does support gestures, but I would really like it if it was actually able to be used in Xorg as well. And there are extensions which actually allow you to use gestures in Xorg, but I'm a little weary when it comes to extensions in GNOME because too many extensions can actually make it unstable. But as of the time I'm recording this video, to be completely honest, I think we can consider it a win on the macOS side when it comes to gestures. When it comes to ports, the new version of the MacBook Pro actually has fewer ports than the previous model that I had. The previous model had 4 USB-C ports, 2 on each side, but the new model only has 2 USB-C ports. Now, a lot of people complained when they removed standard USB-A ports, but I don't really care so much because, honestly, all they're doing is just adopting new technology, and there's nothing Apple-specific when it comes to USB-C. You can find USB-C on pretty much most laptops nowadays. But one thing I think Apple could be accused of is decommissioning ports a little too early. But I get it. They want to use the latest ports, and I don't think that's as big of a problem as people make it out to be. But I do find it a little strange that they removed 2 of the 4 USB-C ports, which just means that there's going to be a greater chance that we'll be forced to use a dongle, such as the one that I'm using right here. And having just 2 USB-C ports wouldn't be so bad if we didn't have to sacrifice one to power the laptop itself, but I'm willing to let that go. Overall, when it comes to the build quality, I think Apple has done a decent job. I don't really hear very many people complaining about the build quality of Apple laptops because generally that's something that they do pretty well. With the previous model, I felt that the laptop ran pretty hot, to the point where it was a bit uncomfortable to type on sometimes because the palm rest would just be so warm that I felt like my wrist needed a break after a while. Now this particular model has that same problem, but it doesn't run as hot as the previous one did, so I feel like I could type longer on this one than I could with that one. And as I record this video, it's actually a bit on the warm side right now, but I'm willing to let that go because I'm using SyncThing in the background to sync a bunch of files over to this thing. So I'm basically giving it a bit of a workout at the moment. So let's talk a bit about macOS. As you might expect, the latest MacBook Pro ships with the latest version of macOS. And now we're actually up to version 11. So for example, if I go up here to About This Mac, we can see that it's running macOS 11.0.1. And personally, I'm a little relieved that Apple has finally incremented the major version number of macOS from version 10 to 11. I found it a little annoying that everyone referred to the operating system as macOS X. The X is, and has always been, a Roman numeral for 10. It was supposed to be pronounced macOS 10, but now we're up to 11, so that should no longer be an issue. And even though this laptop shipped with macOS 11 pre-installed, it still had an update that I needed to install after the fact to move it to 11.0.1, but you know, that's to be expected because they're always releasing new minor versions of macOS, so that's not really too surprising. If you're at all curious, we can go to the system report here. And first of all, the model that I've purchased only has 8 gigabytes of RAM, which is actually down from the 16 that the 2018 model had that I had previous to this. Now on Twitter, I've actually complained that the M1 Macbook Pro maxes out at 16 gigs of RAM, which I thought was a little low for 2020 when competing laptops are shipping with 32 gigs of RAM and even more than that. But then someone on Twitter kindly reminded me that memory management is different on ARM, so I'm willing to let that go for now. And I'll talk a little bit more about compatibility in just a moment, but I'll just randomly click on a few things here if you guys are at all curious. So here we have information on the GPU, Thunderbolt, which is a bit interesting because this particular model doesn't support external GPUs, which personally I feel is a huge downside, especially for the professional users that this model is actually supposed to cater to. But it's good that we have Thunderbolt here because we could still utilize other Thunderbolt devices outside of external GPUs, which again, from my understanding, are not supported. And here's some information on the memory, which again is 8 gigabytes. Not a whole lot of information here. And then we have information on the power as well. Anyway, enough of that. Let's continue talking about macOS. So as a Linux user, I've always found macOS to be really annoying to me. Now to be fair, I like Windows a lot less, so if Linux didn't exist, then macOS would definitely be what I would go with, but there are still some rough edges here that kind of irk me a bit. Now one example of that, let's say I'm working on a document, and right here I have LibreOffice installed, and this is actually one of the files for mastering Ubuntu Server 3rd edition, which is due out very soon. But I opened up LibreOffice and then one of the documents for the book to show you guys an example of a scenario that bothers me whenever it happens, but it's not one that I can trigger right at this very moment. But let's just say hypothetically, I'm in this document, I'm doing some editing, I'm getting some work done. If another app on another workspace comes up with an alert, for example, let's just say an update is available or something like that, we can assume, for example, that Google Chrome is the one that's going to come up with a message, but it doesn't really matter. When that happens, it takes me out of the document that I'm working on and immediately brings me to whatever the app is that came up with the alert. Now, I absolutely hate this, and there are settings that you can configure to make this happen less often, but from my understanding, you actually had to disable this feature completely using the command line, and if I'm not mistaken, it's called Auto Swoosh. So basically, when there's an alert, it'll swoosh you over to the other workspace where that app is, I guess. But I don't think that using the command line disables this feature completely. And I know that some people out there might like that kind of thing, but it's a little out of control because you could have all kinds of apps showing notifications at any time during the day, and you just never really know when your attention is going to be stolen away from the app that you're working on, and then you are forced to look at something else that you didn't ask to look at. I just can't imagine that a ton of people will enjoy being forced out of the application they're working on to somewhere else. But in my personal opinion, when it comes to developing an operating system, implementing something to take the user away from what they're working on should not be something that any developer ever considers implementing. At the very least, if they really have to, possibly have it be an option that can be disabled by default. But the way I see it, the purpose of an operating system is to stay out of the way and let the user get their work done, and only be present and visible when the user needs to, launch another application or something like that, but generally stay out of the way. And this is one of those things that has really, really irked me about macOS. That being said, I haven't had enough time to spend with macOS 11 just yet to see if maybe they have made that a bit better. It has happened in macOS 11, but maybe for all I know, they've included a feature to disable that completely, so I will take another look, research this more, and see if I can get this fixed. And speaking of workspaces, and yes, I know I'm using the Linux terms for pretty much everything because, that's my background. I personally feel that the implementation of workspaces or virtual desktops, whatever you want to call them, in macOS is very clunky when you compare it to something like GNOME. For example, if I swipe on the touchpad 3 fingers up, it brings me to the equivalent of the workspace overview. I have the titles of the workspace up at the top. So you can see I have Thunderbird open right here. I have an empty desktop. And then I have a few more here. And what I don't like about this, one, is that I can't really rename these desktops. There are extensions that you can install in macOS that give you that ability. I can't for the life of me understand why they wouldn't let you do that out of the box. And I feel the same way about extensions in macOS as I do in GNOME. The more extensions you add, the more you risk instability. So I'm not really keen on installing an extension to give me the ability to rename the desktops, especially when that extension is actually installed at a really low level in macOS. I just don't feel like that's a very good thing to do. So that's one minor complaint. But overall, I do feel that the implementation of virtual desktops in macOS is a bit clunky in my opinion, and maybe I'm just spoiled by GNOME. The dynamic workspace feature of GNOME is just amazing. But once you get used to it, it's not so bad. You can switch to a different virtual desktop by holding down Control, and then you can press one of the arrow keys left or right to switch between the virtual desktops here. So that's pretty easy. And you can also use a 3-finger swipe to the left or to the right to do the same thing. Control up gives you the workspace view here. And 3 fingers swiping upward on the trackpad will do the same thing. To add a new virtual desktop, you have to click the plus sign here. And by comparison, GNOME always has an empty workspace available, and as soon as you add an application or run an application in that workspace, it'll create another empty one to basically make sure that you always have an empty workspace. With macOS, you have to manually add the workspaces, which might not be a problem for some people. It might just be a personal preference kind of thing, but I do kind of feel that the workspace implementation here, like I mentioned, is a little clunky compared to Linux, but I can let that go. Now, another interesting quirk about the macOS platform is that I find myself having to purchase a lot of things to do some of the same things that I'm able to do on Linux for free. And it's not like any of the components that I've purchased have cost me a ton of money or anything like that. For example, you can see I have some bars here to keep an eye on memory, CPU, and things like that. And to provide this feature, I had to purchase something called iStat menus. And on Linux, well, I could just set up Conky or something like that, and that would be free. And there's alternatives as well. And this icon right here is from an app called Magnet, which actually gives me the ability to better arrange the windows that are in front of me, which you could argue is a feature that macOS should probably have out of the box, but it doesn't. So I had to buy this in order to fill that gap. And this allows me to get a little creative with how I lay out the windows on the screen. So for example, it's somewhat like tiling in a way, the way that I can actually arrange these windows. But you get the idea. By comparison, Pop! OS has a tiling shell built in. I didn't actually need to purchase anything to get that feature, and it's actually, in my opinion, a lot more powerful because it's a full tiling engine, which can actually arrange the windows for you automatically. But on my end, I have to actually click up here or use one of these keyboard shortcuts. In order to do that, it's not actually going to do that for me. So even though I think that macOS is generally fine, I just feel like it has some rough edges and some missing features that are very common on the Linux desktop that I immediately notice that I'm missing as soon as I start using this. But on my end, I was able to fill most of those gaps by purchasing some additional add-ons and things like that to provide me the features that I'm missing. But since I'm giving you a Linux user's point of view, I do kind of feel like this is a downside by comparison. When it comes to speed and performance, I'll give you guys my opinion on that, but to be fair, it's not a final opinion because as of the time I'm recording this video, the M1 CPU is very new and a lot of applications haven't been ported over to it yet. So currently, most of the applications that you might run on this MacBook are going to run through Rosetta and not through the native CPU directly. So there's going to be a bit of a performance hit there. Just keep that in mind. And currently, I think the only third-party application that I've been able to find that is actually natively supporting the M1 processor is Google Chrome. Other applications, I've had some mixed results. But when it comes to speed, it's decent. But I don't really feel like this laptop runs all that much faster than the previous one. And people are basically saying that the speed of this laptop is absolutely amazing. Well, it does feel a little bit faster, yes, but not as much as people are making it out to be. To be fair, maybe some time just needs to pass and more applications, need to be ported over to the M1. But as of the time I'm recording this video, I don't see as much of a difference in performance as I thought I would, given the opinions that people generally have when it comes to the M1 processor. So you can see I'm running Google Chrome right here, which is not my normal browser. Google Chrome is one of those browsers that I install as my secondary browser, and I use Firefox as my primary browser. And as you can see, I have that installed as well. And when I open it, you can see that it's trying to load something, right here. It's just kind of moving back and forth, but nothing is happening here in the main window. Now, what I've found is that sometimes Firefox actually works, sometimes it doesn't. So let's see what happens when I manually type in the URL for my website. As you can see, nothing's working. So what I'm going to do is just close this. I'll make sure to quit out. And it doesn't want to quit. I'm going to force it to quit. And now it's gone. So sometimes when I close Firefox, it really doesn't want to close. It just kind of gets lost or something like that. So I'll click on it again. And you can see that it's actually working now. That's generally what I find with a lot of the applications. They're just unreliable. And that's because they're actually running through a compatibility layer and not directly on the M1 CPU. So your mileage with previous macOS applications is going to vary. As you can see though, it's working fine right now. So I could basically just click on any of these tabs and it's going to work fine. But eventually it's going to stop working and I'm going to have to force it to quit again and then relaunch it in order to keep using Firefox. So I simply gave up on using Firefox because it's just that unreliable. Now to be fair, the reason why it's unreliable is because Mozilla hasn't released an M1 supported version of Firefox just yet. My understanding, though, is the very next version of Firefox will actually support the M1 CPU, which should fix this problem. But from what I understand, it's not going to be until the 10th of December that they expect to actually have that out. So as of the time I'm recording this video, Firefox users basically just have no stable version of Firefox to use. It'll kind of work, but then sometimes it won't. Now similarly, switch over here to another workspace. I've installed Diablo 3. And immediately it actually didn't work. The game wouldn't even launch. But then there was actually an update that Apple released, and as soon as they did that, Diablo 3 started to work. Now again, it's up to the application developers to port their applications to the M1, but whether or not they do, that's on them. But meanwhile, Apple users are going to have a little bit of a challenge, and they're going to notice some inconsistency. So if I click play, let's see what happens. And we can see it's loading up. I'm not capturing audio right now, but you get the idea. I'm just going to play a few seconds of this. But so far, it actually seems to be working just fine. I did notice that it's a bit sluggish. I don't know if it's coming through in the screen recording here. It's a little jittery, but I think that's actually due to the screen recorder. The screen recorder is actually using a different refresh rate of just like 30 or something like that, 30 Hertz. So due to the mismatch when I mirror the screens, you're going to see a bit of lag here. But it actually runs just fine other than that, in my opinion. The fact that there's some lag is not due to Diablo 3 because I bet when I disconnect the screen recorder it's going to work just fine, and it generally does. But as you can see, I'm able to play Diablo 3, so that's actually fairly promising. But when it all comes down to it, Apple users are going to notice some inconsistency with applications until more and more developers port their applications to the new CPU. Now, one problem here is that while developers should port their applications over to the M1, will they? I have no idea. I feel like most of them will. Most of the popular applications probably will. But there's going to be some applications out there that just might not get updated, either because the developer abandoned the application or because they just don't really want to or can't take on the extra work. So I think Apple users are going to experience this inconsistency on the platform for a little while now, probably for a year or two, but I hope I'm wrong. Maybe they'll get this straightened out sooner, but for now, that's what Apple users are going to be dealing with. But anyway, as of today, I do have to say that the new MacBook performs fairly well. Now again, I don't notice any improvements in speed for the most part. It does feel slightly faster, just not a lot faster like some people make it out to be. But again, that's going to be hit or miss as the platform stabilizes in the future. Now, when it comes to whether or not I'll be using the MacBook more often, given the new model and the new version of the operating system, so far, no. I think I'm going to stay on Linux. I don't really think that's going to change anytime soon, if ever. I can see that they've made some actual awesome improvements, and I love the ARM CPU. I think that it's the future. It's the way to go. I think they did make the right decision in switching to it. I think it could be a bit too early, but it seems to be going okay for Apple, so yeah, we'll let that continue. But I still prefer Linux. There's some quirks here that, just annoy me, like I've mentioned a few times now. And I don't really feel envious of this platform at all. I think the MacBook is going to continue to be a secondary laptop that I use for one-off things here and there, especially given the fact that I intend to record more footage on Windows and macOS when I go through a tutorial. That way, regardless of which operating system you are using on your side, you'll see an example for how to set up whatever it is I'm going over in that video for your platform. I think that's the way that it's going to remain for the foreseeable future, but I thought it might be fun to do a quick review and give you guys my thoughts on the new M1 MacBook, and well, I've done that. So what are your opinions of the new MacBook, macOS, or anything you would like to discuss? Let me know in the comments down below. I look forward to reading your comments. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe. I have some awesome content coming very soon. Thanks for watching.